Come on over here, sugar buns. This machine just called me an a**hole.
By the early 1980s, Stephen King was officially a household name. After penning such instantly memorable titles as Carrie, The Shining, and The Stand, it was highly unlikely to find someone who had not read, or at least heard of, a Stephen King novel. The writer was getting so big that pretty much anything he published landed in the #1 spot on the bestseller list. But would his devoted readers gobble up anything he produced? That was put to the test in 1982, when King convinced his publisher to release a collection of 4 novellas he had written between novels. The stories did have some familiar King elements, but for the most part they were straight dramas dealing with the human condition. The collection was called Different Seasons, and while it was not a success on the same level as his previous books, it sold well enough to keep King's name in the spotlight. More than that, however, it proved the author could write engaging material beyond horror. One of those novellas, titled The Body, was inspired by King's memories as a teenager growing up in a 1950s blue-collar household. The tale followed 4 young men on a trip into the deep woods to find the dead body of a man supposedly hit by a train. During the brief 2-day journey, they discover much about themselves and lose a sizable piece of their innocence. Not necessarily obvious source material for a movie, let alone a great movie. So how did this relatively minor work from the master of the macabre eventually become an often quoted classic of 80s cinema?
Now he said sick 'em boy, but what I heard was chopper sick balls.
Have some pie and find out what the happened to this movie. The saga of Stand By Me begins in 1983, when writers Reynold Gideon and Bruce Evans both fell in love with King's novella. Seeking to secure the rights, they contacted King's agent, who promptly told them King wanted $100 grand for the story, and 10% of the box office gross. Needless to say, a whole lot of money, especially for a project that would not have any bankable stars in the lead roles. Gideon thought attaching a hot director to the project would help get it off the ground, and he just so happened to be friends with one, Adrian Lyne, who was coming off the massive success of Flashdance. Lyne liked the story and was tentatively on board, and Evans and Gideon would spend 2 months on the screenplay, while independent company Embassy Pictures was, perhaps surprisingly, the only studio in town even remotely interested in producing this unusual coming-of-age tale. But one issue reared its head early on. Though he was theoretically intrigued by the project, Adrian Lyne wanted to take a break after making his Flashdance follow-up 9.5 weeks. In fact, he wanted to take a very long vacation, 6 months. Gideon and Evans flinched, knowing full well that they had to strike while the iron was hot. Lyne gave up the project to go on vacation.
Show's over. Everybody go back to doing what you were doing.
And The Body instead found itself in the hands of Rob Reiner. The former All in the Family actor had already directed 2 pictures for Embassy, This Is Spinal Tap and The Sure Thing, and before long he was on board to direct a very different kind of movie for him, but one that he could still infuse with his comedic sensibilities.
The numbers all go to 11.
Does that mean it's louder? Is it any louder?
Well, it's 1 louder, isn't it?
Why don't you just make 10 louder and make 10 be the top number and make that a little louder?
These go to 11.
Although he was enthused about the script, Reiner felt it needed some work. He couldn't quite put his finger on the issue until he realized the script lacked a focus. As was the case with King's novella, the 4 boys were given equal weight in the screenplay, a traditional ensemble. But Reiner was drawn to the character of Gordy LaChance, a burgeoning writer still traumatized by the death of his beloved older brother. Gordy feels lost in the world, especially in his own home, where he is basically persona non grata in the eyes of his judgmental father. Having grown up feeling lost in the shadow of his own famous father, legendary comedian Carl Reiner, Rob felt a kinship with Gordy, which led to the character becoming the focal point of the narrative. The revised script was given the green light by Embassy, with a budget of $8 million. Reiner was evidently meticulous when it came to crewing the film, taking personal interest in selecting stagehands, prop men, electricians, grips, the entire unit. Reiner reasoned that, quote, "It takes only one jerk to ruin the attitudes and camaraderie of a movie company." Casting would be just as meticulous. Reiner knew that young men in the 11 to 14 age range couldn't necessarily bring the kind of intense performances he would need just by acting ability alone, so he intentionally chose actors who seemed close in personality to their respective character. Supposedly, Reiner auditioned at least 70 young actors, eventually landing on River Phoenix as the soulful de facto leader of the group, Chris, Will Wheaton as the haunted Gordy, Corey Feldman as rage-filled reprobate Teddy, and Jerry O'Connell in his very first movie as gullible goofball Vern. To play Gordy's deceased older brother Denny in flashbacks, Reiner called in a favor from his Sure Thing star John Cusack. And to play sadistic town bully Ace Merrill, Reiner cast Kiefer Sutherland, son of Hollywood royalty Donald, in one of his first major roles. Reiner felt Sutherland's soft-spoken voice and calm demeanor would make Ace far more frightening than an actor who might go over the top with his performance. Casting the adult Gordy, who bookends the film and serves as narrator, proved to be a challenge as well. Reiner first cast actor David Dukes, but while recording his voiceovers, Reiner found he didn't think the actor's voice was right. Next, he tried his Spinal Tap frontman Michael McKean, who didn't quite work out either. Reiner eventually landed on Richard Dreyfuss, whom he had known for years, and had actually appeared with Wheaton in the 1984 comedy The Buddy System. For 2 weeks before production began, Reiner and his 4 leads went to Oregon, where filming would take place, to engage in a bonding experience playing theater games and trust exercises to better acquaint the boys with one another. There was also much rehearsal, as the dialogue was complex, and in some cases profane, and Reiner wanted to ensure that his young leads would be well prepared as soon as principal photography began. Reiner would later say that after the 2 weeks of hanging out together, the 4-kid unit was a well-oiled machine.
Okay. Show me.
And that principal photography almost did not happen. Literally 2 days before filming was set to begin, the production got word that Embassy Pictures had been sold to Coca-Cola, which promptly shut down the movie. The cast and crew were afraid they would have to drop everything and head home. But instead, they found themselves rescued by a legend in the business, Norman Lear. The Hollywood veteran was the previous owner of Embassy before it was acquired by the soda company, and because he still strongly believed in the project, he fronted the necessary $8 million out of his own pocket. It probably also didn't hurt that Lear was the creator and producer of All in the Family back in the day, so he knew that show's lovable meathead Rob Reiner very well. Once back on track, the production would take approximately 2 months to shoot. Just like the characters in the story, the stars would grow up fast in real life. For Feldman, it was his first time shooting a movie without his parents around, liberating him to release some of the aggression that had built up inside of him. Feldman and River Phoenix, who had a similarly contentious relationship with his parents, would wander into town after shooting and hang out with local teens, and the 2 young men quickly discovered the allure of beer and marijuana. Unfortunately, this might be considered the origins of a long road of addiction that only one of them would eventually survive. Feldman's questionable behavior also allegedly included bullying, and he once got into a very real fight with Will Wheaton. One day, Reiner pulled Feldman into his trailer and gave him an extended reprimand, after which the young actor put himself on a more professional path. Will Wheaton, on the other hand, was a very good boy indeed, probably because his imperious mother/manager was never far away on the set. Sadly, it turns out that making the film was also a dark time for Wheaton, who related to Gordy's home life of isolation and scapegoat status because he experienced the same treatment from his own family. Wheaton has recently revealed that his abusive parents had forced him into becoming a child actor, and the mental health struggles he still contends with as an adult are a direct result of that troubled childhood. As Wheaton has said, quote, "When I watch Stand By Me now, I cannot ignore the unbelievable sadness in my eyes." A very notable experience for River Phoenix happened at one point. He supposedly lost his virginity at the age of 15, and with a family friend and his parents' blessing beforehand, with the experience taking place in a ceremonial tent somewhere in the Oregon woods. Feldman later said that when Phoenix came back from that experience, he was a changed man, understandably. While the young actors were all naturally talented, Reiner would sometimes have to coax a little something extra out of them. The scene where Chris laments being unfairly blamed for stealing the school milk money is one of the most moving in the film, but Reiner had to get Phoenix to truly break down believably. Before shooting, Reiner instructed the young actor to think of a time when an adult had really let him down. That apparently struck a nerve, because Phoenix absolutely crushed the emotional moment, although he never revealed what memory he used to help get him there. Incidentally, the scene was not in the original script. Reiner wrote it in a hotel room and cried to himself while doing it. And while that campfire sequence might look as though it's really taking place in the woods at night, the entire thing was shot inside a warehouse dressed to look like the great outdoors. Another of the movie's famous scenes involves the boys fleeing an approaching train on a trestle bridge. While it certainly looks like the train is bearing right down on them, it was in fact very far away, an effect achieved by using an extremely long lens, making it appear like the train is mere yards away from them. This was another occasion where Reiner needed to give his actors a nudge, as Wheaton and O'Connell just did not look convincingly terrified, and the director was disappointed with take after take. Finally, he yelled at the two kids and blamed them for wearing out the crew and wasting everybody's time. Genuinely shocked, Wheaton and O'Connell quite believably screamed and cried during the next take, which is the one that wound up in the film. As soon as he called cut, Reiner apologized and hugged the two boys, who were both still bawling their eyes out. Yet another memorable sequence sees the foursome fall into a swamp and subsequently find themselves covered with blood-sucking leeches. This was based on something that King himself had experienced as a teen. The actual sludgy pond was man-made, a giant hole dug in the middle of the forest and filled with water before principal photography. That said, by the time they actually got around to shooting the scene, it had become a disgusting, bug-filled body of mucky water. For all intents, it had transformed into the grotesque pond where the characters slosh around. Fortunately, the slimy leeches were just realistic props. And then, of course, is the notorious fictional pie-eating contest. Believe it or not, Reiner had actually later considered cutting that unforgettable spew-spraying sequence from the film, as he was concerned it was just too silly and inconsistent with the rest of the picture. But everyone who saw the outrageous sequence loved it, and the scene would get such big laughs at early screenings that the director decided to keep it in, describing it as a literal giant splash of color in an otherwise gentle tone poem. After photography had wrapped, there was still a matter of distribution.
Little pigs, let me come in.
As this was an indie without a studio behind it, Reiner and company found a champion in Michael Ovitz, the infamous then head of Creative Arts Agency. Ovitz loved the film, but even he couldn't get anyone to distribute it. Finally, he essentially forced it upon Columbia Pictures honcho Guy McElwain, who initially had no interest, but when the exec screened it in his home with his kids in attendance, his attitude changed when he saw how much they adored it. He ultimately ended up taking on the picture with Columbia's full marketing force behind it. An equally important screening took place for the man who created the body, none other than Stephen King. Reiner held a private screening for the author, and after it was over, King seemed visibly moved, reportedly excusing himself for 15 minutes. Soon after, he approached Reiner and told him it was the best movie made based on his work. King admitted to Reiner that Gordy was based on himself, and the best friend who had inspired him to become a writer actually did die as a young man. To this day, King maintains that Stand By Me is one of the best adaptations of his stories, another, of course, being The Shawshank Redemption, which also came from different seasons. At some point along the way, the movie's title changed from The Body to Stand By Me, inspired by the iconic Ben E. King song. Reiner and the studio thought if people saw something based on a Stephen King story called The Body, they would naturally assume it was a horror movie. The song was crucial to the film and ended up enjoying newfound success after its release, even getting a music video, and the song ended up in the top 10 of the pop charts some 25 years after it was originally produced. Interestingly, Reiner had considered hiring Michael Jackson to do an updated version of the song for the end credits, even screening the film for the pop star, but he wisely decided to stick with the classic original. Stand By Me was released in August of 1986, a year after shooting had wrapped. Initially a limited release for 2 weeks, the film went wide on August 22nd and shot to the number 2 spot, right behind David Cronenberg's gooey remake of The Fly. The following week, it was in first place, and positive word of mouth kept it in the top 5 until the middle of October. It eventually ended up collecting $52 million domestic off an $8 million budget, and found further success on home video and cable, where it became a hugely influential movie for an entire generation of up-and-coming film fans. Over 35 years later, Stand By Me has lost none of its power. Alternately heartwarming and heartbreaking, its authentic spirit and inherent good nature ensure it will remain a go-to movie for anyone who considers it an integral part of their coming of age. Like a good friend, it will always be there when you need it, and it won't even give you 2 for flinching.
Thank you for clicking on our video, everybody. If you like what you saw here, please make sure you like the video and subscribe and share with your friends who like this sort of content. JoBlo remains an independent company, and we appreciate all of your support.